Okay, so the 2023 animation ranking is taking me way longer than expected, and I might not be able to get it out until early January. I just figured I'd let you guys know that ahead of time, since I'm guessing that was the next video most of you guys were expecting from me. But just know that I'm working to get it out as soon as possible, so stay tuned. To my surprise, Nando v Movies announced one final collaboration of scene analyses, simply titled One Last Scene. You might remember when I did one of these collaborations last year, where he requested we talk about a scene based on music. I chose to talk about the dance party sequence in The Bad Guys and how it contributed to making the characters' transition throughout the story more authentic. This year, he wants us to discuss an ending, whether it be from a movie, show, video game, anything. I think this is the perfect conclusion to this annual tradition that I knew I wanted to be a part of. Now, initially, I was gonna talk about the ending of The Bad Guys because, I'm the problem, it's me. But then I realized that I knew an even better scene that I needed to talk about, and it's not even one from a movie. It's one from a series. The perfect sequel series. With the exception of the last 2 seasons of Succession, Fiona and Cake might be my favorite piece of television that's come out of the 2020s. I have a video talking about why I like it so much and how well it works as a successor to Adventure Time, but I wanted to draw attention to one specific moment in the season finale that I wish I elaborated on there. I'm not going to be going in depth about the literal final scene of the episode though, cause that's one of the very few weak points of the show overall, and I said everything I needed to say about it already. I'm talking about a different kind of ending. The ending of an arc in this season's final moments.
I stood by and allowed you to sacrifice yourself for me, even though part of me should have known better.
This is the best scene in the show, it's not even a contest. Why do I think that though? One of my biggest praises that I gave this show when it came out was that it has strong character moments that operate on their own merits but are enhanced if you've watched the original Adventure Time series. And that's what the best legacy shows can accomplish. It's a good way to expand beyond your core audience by making something accessible to people unfamiliar with the missing context that comes from the piece of media that it stems from. And I'm going to be talking about Simon and Betty's final moments together from both perspectives. Once again, if you want my more in-depth thoughts on the show as a whole, I recommend watching my original video. Now, I don't think anyone watching this video needs a reintroduction to the Ice King. Besides SpongeBob, I think this is the role people most associate with Tom Kenny. Goofy, recurring supervillain of Adventure Time who has ice powers, likes to capture princesses, and has a pet penguin. This is who Simon was before the events of Fiona and Cake. And I know some people like to look at the two of them as different characters, but I think viewing them as the same person makes his writing throughout the story a lot stronger. My favorite Adventure Time episode is I Remember You because it's a way for the past and present of his character to finally connect with each other. And it fully humanizes him despite who he used to be being established to be long gone. To talk about this scene, I think it's important to know what role Betty plays in his journey throughout the original show. Because even though it is one of my favorites of all time, I think this is one of the weaker story arcs. Her debut appearance is in her namesake episode where the Ice King briefly turns back into Simon, but we find out that he's not able to survive without the crown's powers. Yet. While he's like this, he goes back in time to see Betty and apologize for all his regrets since he thinks he might be dying. But it backfires because she finds out and turns him back to the Ice King against his will. She really wants to be with him again and spends the rest of the series trying to find a way to keep him alive as Simon without the crown. It comes at the cost of her own sanity in the process though, as she goes through dangerous magic and rituals she uses to get what she wants. They have very limited time in the show to actively exist as a couple until Come Along With Me, and that's when they're slowly being digested by a cosmic entity. They get to share a really tender moment when they de-age, and then Betty takes on the crown's powers to set him and Finn free, sacrificing herself in the process. Adventure Time's finale is definitely pretty divisive amongst fans, and while I'd say I'm more positive about it, this plot development was something that initially didn't work for me, because it feels incomplete. We don't get a chance to see Simon grieve this person person who was so significant to him because it's in the background of a grand finale that occurs towards the end. Our emotional investment in their romance is heavily reliant on what happens in the past being told to us, primarily from Betty's point of view. Most of the time we're following this romance from her perspective as she desperately tries to connect with the out-of-touch Ice King, who is only a shadow of the man she fell in love with. And the only reason I really got attached to her as a character before is because of how much I was rooting for him. We know everything about why he's the Ice King, and he still has his own lovable and innocent personality that comes with his alternate persona. There's a deeply tragic undercurrent to his character, and you want him to do whatever he can to be happy. And if that means reuniting with his former flame, yeah, go for it, buddy. But when he has equally, if not stronger relationships with more fleshed out characters like Gunter and Marceline, his romance with Betty doesn't carry the same weight. I think Fiona in Cake does an excellent job of rectifying these issues. Of course, there's the actual aftermath of Simon having to process his grief over losing her throughout the show's duration. But I think the thing that enhances this romance being a significant part of this story the most is something the original series needed more of. Flashbacks. Because here's another semi-controversial take that I have about the original show. Betty isn't the most likable character out there. I'm aware that she wants to protect Simon, but it's always come across as more selfish than noble, since it hardly feels like she cares about his well-being. Wanting to keep him alive is a strong character motivation, but it's important to note that his trauma once he regains his memories briefly. He knows the harm he's done as Ice King, and doesn't want to be forced back into what would be a psychological prison if he puts the crown back on. But Betty straight up ignores him, like completely ignores his request because she's that confident she can have the best of both worlds. I'm sure these flaws were intentional, but if you want her to hold on to Simon to this extent, then you need to do a better job at showcasing why. Give us more moments from the past where we get to see how much he means to her, even though we already know how much she means to him. This is where Simon's relationship with Marcy excels. We get an entire episode dedicated to showing us why she matters to him, and it provides a much deeper understanding of why she stands alongside him despite everything he's put her through. He willfully took on the crown's powers to protect her when she was young, and she knows that he's still good at heart. And the motivations for Betty going the lengths she goes to aren't just something that can be implied in order for the romance to hit hard emotionally. So now that we have the groundwork for the original show, let's take a look at what we have with their relationship just in the context of this show. One of the very first scenes with Simon is him trying to use magic to bring Betty back to life in a similar way she did when he was the Ice King. And just like Betty, he fails. It's been implied that he has been consistently. On its own, this wouldn't hold the same gravity for someone who hasn't watched Adventure Time, so the show provides exposition that's new to Fiona and both sets of audience members, how Simon and Betty fell in love. These flashback sequences are perfect for establishing the story of their romance. They offer up a lot of levity amidst the darker moments of the show, and they give us a much more clear understanding of Betty as a person. She deeply admires Simon because of his intellect and wants to explore the world with him, even giving up her own dreams to do so. And what starts out as a mentorship ends up turning into a bit of a, I mean, I'm kind of about having her be one of his students, but they have such good chemistry that it's not a big deal to me. And yeah, it's probably pretty realistic, all things considered. There is one very key flashback that sets up the scene we're finally analyzing. It's the moment where Betty decides not to go on an Australian expedition and wants to be by Simon's side as he continues to search for the Enchiridion. She leaves him a note in a book in the library where she says she's grown from just being inspired by his research to being inspired by him as a person. And this leads to him chasing after her before she gets on the bus and convincing her not to go because he feels the same way. This is the final flashback that we get before the final 2 episodes, where Simon is reunited with her in Golb's dimension.
Hear me, Golb!
Golb?
Not gonna say it, not gonna say it, not gonna say it, not gonna say it. In the finale, Fiona's universe is at risk of being erased, and since it's in Simon's head, he thinks he has to become Ice King again. Not just to prevent that from happening, but also to restore the magic that was once there. And he's been dead set on doing it, even though Fiona encouraged against it after seeing his past for the first time. Who is the one that ends up stopping him? Betty. but not his Betty. This is a very overt way of telling us there's still a small part of her mind that exists amidst her chaotic fusion with Golb. And once Simon realizes this, he just starts talking to her like normal, lamenting all the regrets and guilt he has over her sacrifice. He doesn't think that he ever put her needs before his. Initially, I was sort of confused by this because Betty made the conscious choice to let Simon be free. It was her dying wish that allowed her to save the world in the end. But then he draws attention to that flashback at the bus stop where we finally enter her mind, their way of communicating with each other.
Even though part of me should have known better. Like that day at the bus stop. Betty!
Identical imagery and identical dialogue. The two key differences are Simon having an omnipotent presence and the red overlay now covering everything, aside from the current Simon, showing how he's just an observer at this point in their lives, which based on that red is implied to be told from Betty's point of view, a memory of hers. Simon has a line of dialogue where he suggested if he didn't have Betty come with him, then maybe he wouldn't have ever become the Ice King and they could be together. The thought of that reality is so tempting that he decides to make an attempt to change the way things go, now blending in with the Simon covered in the red overlay. He tells her that the Enchiridion can wait and that he wants to go exploring with her. Since this is a memory, Betty being enthusiastic about this almost makes it seem like he's going back in time. I mean, technically Essokinesis is one of Golb's abilities, so theoretically it could work. But as he gets back on the bus, reality starts to sink in again. Not just for Simon, but for Betty as well. Think about it, she was equally enthusiastic about their new journey, and if she knew it couldn't happen, then she could have said something along the lines of, I want to, but I can't. The temptation is just as strong for her, and you can hear the disappointment in her voice when she responds to him.
But wait, this isn't how it happened.
No, we made our choices. We could have made better ones, but I don't have any regrets.
Let's take a look at both of their circumstances throughout both series as their authentic selves. Without the crown's powers, Simon is struggling to find purpose and continues to chase after the one person he believes would give him that. When he meets Fiona and Cake, his immediate plan to restore the magic in their universe is to become Ice King again. He thinks that will give him purpose, but that would also mean sacrificing who he truly is. Sound familiar? I think in this scene, Betty sees the worst parts of herself carrying over to Simon, who has a blank slate now that he's finally obtained his autonomy. And continuing to chase after her is to go down the same path that she did. Simon was willing to give himself up to save others, just like Betty did for him. But she sees through that mindset, and it's why she stops him. A part of me wonders if Betty's lines, "We made our choices, and we could have made better ones," are an acknowledgement of not being able to change the past, and that they shouldn't dwell on the regrets they have because of it. Simon choosing to go to Australia with Betty would probably mean that they could be a couple, but it would also mean that he would never have taken in Marceline, which we saw the direct consequences of in episode 7. That's an astonishing level of thematic attention to detail. The parallels between their characters feel very deliberate, and it humanizes Betty in a way that gives us a much deeper understanding of why she did everything she did. Since this is her in the present talking, I also think it's her subtly acknowledging her own mistakes. It's not only her absolving Simon of the responsibility of her decisions. It's also a personal reflection on the damage she contributed to in their relationship. She might not have been the one that found the crown, but she was the one that went through so many hurdles to bring back the Simon she knew. The one that made her feel special, the one that she was able to bond with over their shared love for science and adventure. But her inability to accept him as the Ice King, even after he's shown significant growth, is what killed her in the end. This is an extremely clever way for this scene to play out. If you're not familiar with the original Adventure Time narrative, you still have a tragic love story about a couple torn apart by circumstances that make it so they can never be together despite how strong their bond once was, having to watch the other be unable to process their grief. And with the knowledge of what happens in the show, it actively enhances the plotline with added context that gives us a much deeper and more nuanced understanding of both of these characters. Betty tells Simon how wonderful of an experience he was, and that she doesn't have any remorse for the time that they got to spend with each other. And struggling to figure out the last thing he wants to say to her, he says, "You were everything," before she climbs onto the bus. But the last thing Simon actually says to her is when he asks, "Where are you going?" And the stop changes from airport to something in a different language, with Betty's appearance now mirroring her current form. not gonna say it, not gonna say it, not gonna say it, not gonna say it. I think it's brilliant how this location is explicitly kept ambiguous because it's not the focus of this scene. No matter where she's going, it's somewhere that Simon can't follow her. But it is a reminder that Simon can still hold on to the memories that they have with each other. In my previous video, I made a joke about how there's a statue of her and Fiona in Cake's world before changing into Golb in the ending montage. It is still very funny, but it's also meant to be symbolic of Simon's acceptance of the way things are, just like Fiona's acceptance of the way her non-magic world is. And I've got one last stray thought that I wanted to bring up. Recently, it was confirmed that Fiona and Cake would be renewed for a second season by Max, and I'm very curious to see what they end up doing with Simon moving forwards. After all, he's essentially the tritagonist of the show alongside the two leads, and I think it would be incomplete if he was absent. I want to see this new phase of his life and what's next for him. Even if he isn't the focal point of the narrative next season, I'd at least like him to have a prominent supporting role for whatever comes next for these characters. We don't know what's in store for him right now, but this final moment between him and Betty is the conclusivity of his character that simply was not present in the finale of Adventure Time. It made me get invested in a part of his past I initially didn't find captivating. And in a way, to move on from Betty is also to move on from Ice King. This is an ending because it's the start of a new beginning.
I brought it home and excitedly showed my fiancée Betty. I jokingly put it on my head just for a laugh or something. And that's when it started.
Thanks for making this a better year for me, Minnows, and I'll see you again at the edge of the water.